global leaders are not trusting America, and people inside America are not trusting America as well. What happens in both situations? Let's talk about that. When the world stops trusting America, what happens then?
Well,
because clearly they have, and they've shown so many signs in so many places where you can't trust them, like Afghanistan. So now all their allies are worried that if they can leave Afghanistan overnight, how can we rely on them for security?
And I'm glad you mentioned Afghanistan, because that wasn't Trump.
Mhm.
That was Biden. And Biden, I mean, when the U.S. went into Afghanistan, the Americans asked all these countries to join. The decision to leave Afghanistan, they didn't ask the coalition members. And I think a lot of countries around the world said, why should we trust you?
Yeah.
So this is not new.
Hmm.
It is being accelerated by Trump, and he's certainly benefiting politically from it in the United States, but it's not new. It's been coming for decades now. I think, but the reality is that even if these countries don't trust America, in many ways, they still rely on the United States. So Japan still relies on the U.S. for defense, and that's not going to change in the next year. The Mexicans overwhelmingly rely on the United States for trade and investment and tourism and remittances. The Canadians overwhelmingly rely on the United States for a market, right? That's not going to change tomorrow. So I think you're seeing a few things. The first thing you're seeing is that countries around the world are starting to diversify more, to have less exposure to the U.S. incrementally and more exposure to other countries, so that the Americans will not be able to hurt them as much with their unpredictability. You see this with the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. Mercosur is the largest trading group in Latin America. They had been talking for years and years. The deal was basically dead. It was stalled. It wasn't going anywhere. Trump puts all these tariffs on. They get together. They say, we got to do this deal. You see Mark Carney. The Canadians had a really bad relationship with India. You remember, sort of the killing of this one Canadian citizen. They got into a big fight. Mark reaches out to the Indian prime minister. They fix it. Big piece of that. Can't trust the Americans. Need better relations there. Europeans spending much more on defense, right? And coordinating more amongst themselves for ballistic missile defense that is parallel with NATO. So you don't necessarily rely only on the United States. So the first point is you want to diversify your exposures. This is not a middle power coordination. It's not like there's a new middle power block that's developing. That's not happening. They are too small, too diffuse, not coordinated, don't share enough interests. But all of the middle powers are engaging in the same hedging strategy to reduce at the margins their exposure. But a second thing that happens is you invest more in your own resilience. So if you're a Gulf state and you can't count on the Americans for the Strait of Hormuz, you need to build out your security, your defense. If you're the Europeans and you can't count on the Americans for Ukraine, you've got to spend a lot more on your own defense. The Japanese are doing the same thing. But what you can't do is pretend that reality doesn't exist. And reality is that the United States is still the most powerful country. Yeah. The United States is still the most powerful defense capability. The U.S. is, along with China, the most powerful technology. And these countries that are allied with the U.S. don't suddenly trust China just because they worry about the United States. And so, you have to maintain your base level of relationship and exposure to the U.S. in many, many ways, even if it feels more uncomfortable, even if it makes you feel more vulnerable. And this is why it's so important to have a podcast conversation, because if you're talking on cable news, you're talking on social media, it's like America's superpower, no, America's in decline. I like America, no, I hate America. It's not about that. World leaders don't get to make yes, no decisions like that. They have to live with reality. And reality is that even though the United States has become much less trustworthy over time, and that has actually accelerated in the past years, there's still a very significant amount of dependency that needs to be recognized and maintained.
But is it the start of the decline then? If the world doesn't trust you anymore and they're only dependent on you because they have to, it's their need, it's their only on the things that they don't trust you, like they don't want to build relationship or they don't want to invest into newer things with you. They are just dependent on certain things where they don't have any other alternative or any other choice. So the moment of the day they'll have another alternative, they'll probably pull out.
Well, let's recognize a couple things. First of all, if I look at the last 30 years, geopolitically, if you want to talk about power, there have been a couple different things that have happened. One is that China and India have been rising. China much faster, India more recently with Modi, but that has been happening. They're becoming more influential, more powerful. Yeah. Secondly, America's allies have gotten weaker. They are demographically, many of them are shrinking, like Japan, South Korea, much of Europe. They have not invested in defense. They haven't invested adequately in technology. Their productivity and their growth has slipped. So the former group, India and China, you could definitely see them becoming more independent, diversifying, even decoupling to a much greater degree. The advanced industrial democracies, it's not as if they are becoming so strong that they can suddenly go off on their own. This middle power strategy that Mark Carney, Alex Stubb, the Finnish president, others have been talking about, that there isn't a there because for the last 30 years, those countries have gotten weaker. So, I mentioned that now that they find that the Americans are less trustworthy and less dependable, they're starting to finally invest much more in themselves. But it's late. You needed the Draghi plan for Europe. You needed that 20, 30 years ago. You didn't need it in 2025, in 2026. So I think that what you're describing is we're very far from that. Mm-hmm. And the other point is that I think we don't know what kind of political system is going to succeed in the future. I think we don't know whether governments are going to be principal actors or whether technology companies are. We don't know if power is going to be more centralized or decentralized because AI is moving so fast. So now you're asking me about in 10 and 20 years' time, might the United States be declining? The answer to that may well be yes. The role of the US dollar as reserve currency may be considerably less in 20 years than today, but that may not be because other countries are more important. It may be because countries are less important, period. Mm-hmm. It may be because actually our present geopolitical order doesn't really work. Let me give you a big example of this that I think is worth considering. So let's imagine that you're an alien and you come down to the planet right now. You've traveled light years away and in 2026, you suddenly encounter Earth, Earth with 8+ billion people on it. And you go, wow, I came here at exactly the right time because for billions of years, almost nothing was happening. And now suddenly human beings are developing the technologies that will allow them to transform the earth around them, transform themselves, and create tools that can be even smarter than they are. In a cosmological eye blink, what an exciting time for the aliens to come down and see this planet. So then the aliens say, okay, now I wonder what kind of governance, how do they actually run this society? Because that's kind of interesting as a second order question. And then you look around and you see that there's no global governance at all. None. You've got these technologies that's going to completely transform humanity and the planet, and there is no global governance. You've got a Security Council that doesn't work with core countries that veto everything. You've got a United Nations with almost no money and no influence. And otherwise, you've got decisions that are being made by these nominally sovereign countries that have delineated territory amongst themselves. Sometimes they fight over it. Most of them don't trust each other. Yeah. Some of them hate each other. If the aliens look down at that, they'd say, this is not sustainable. Right?
Yeah.
And you'd know that.
Yeah.
And so when you ask me a question like, is the United States in decline in 20 years' time? And are people going to like move away from it? I see the world is moving so fast. Technology is moving so fast that the right answer to that question is, what kind of governance are we going to need? What kind of rules are we going to need as 8 billion people on the planet in 20 years? I don't think those problems, I don't think that question is primarily going to be resolved by saying the United States is or isn't in decline. I think that was the right question to ask in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the right question to ask in 1945 when the Nazis were defeated. It is not the right question to ask in 2026. Not for the Indians, not for the Americans.